Hi, Mike. Thank you so much for joining me on the Casual Birder podcast.
Hi, Susie.
For people watching, this is only the second time I've done one of these. So if there's any technical issues, please let me know about them. I'm doing this through a technical website called StreamYard, and I've been a guest on many StreamYard presentations, and they've gone beautifully. So if anything goes wrong, it's down to me. But anyway, just let me know. So, Mike, you're a biodiversity advisor for Anglian Water, is that right?
That's correct, yeah. I've been the advisor for just over 14 years now.
Wow. And for 10 of those years, you've been involved in Nightingale research alongside your day job.
Yep, it's very interesting to be kind of getting up at 3 o'clock in the morning to be going out into kind of those dark early mornings and to go and survey for nightingales, and then to kind of carry on with the day job not long after that.
And yes, that would be quite trying, I would think, even though it must be a magnificent experience to actually spend so much time with nightingales. I think that I heard my first one this year. We've just been to Suffolk on a vacation, and I haven't had a chance yet to send you the little bit of audio recording that I did. But from all the ones that you've sent me and that I've heard, I'm pretty sure that's what I finally heard, but I've never seen one. So I'm really excited to hear all about your research with them and your very close contact with them. Before we start the questions that I've got for you,
Yep.
one of the things I'd like to say is to any audience watching, there will be a chance for questions and answers. Well, hopefully answers, but there'll be a chance for questions later on. It may be that when you ask the question in the chat, that I can't see who has asked the question, because unless you've given StreamYard permission to know who you are, it won't tell me. So if you do ask any questions, could you just put a name at the end of the question, just so that we know who has asked? Even if we don't know you directly, we'll at least be able to say, Susie has asked this question. Okay, so Mike, you have been interested in birds, you told me, ever since you were a young child. Can you remember your first experiences with birds?
I was trying to think about that, but I think from what my parents have said, that as soon as I was able to walk, that I was always kind of interested in wildlife, from the very small things, from like ants to spiders, right the way up to birds. And my mum used to say that, because when I was little, I could never properly say bird, and actually we used to refer to them as a dower. So I'd be sitting in a pushchair going, dower, dower, and pointing out birds from a pushchair. So it was kind of from a very early age that I would be pointing out birds. And then as I kind of grew up, and it kind of developed from there. So when I went through school, it was not really a cool thing to be labelling, or it's like identifying birds and that. So kind of those kind of things were kept a little bit quiet whilst I went through school. But then, then it kind of grew really after that, and to here I am today.
So, and I totally hear what you're saying about it perhaps being a little bit uncool when we were at school to talk about birds. But thankfully, it seems the tide is turning, and there are a lot of young people getting involved in bird watching nowadays. And so it's definitely not uncool to talk about birds. It's probably uncool to say cool, but but it's not uncool to talk about birds. So when did you start sort of getting more involved with birds? When was it that you felt more comfortable talking about birds and being, out in nature looking for them?
I think it would almost be going towards the latter part of my school years, when I was getting ready to go to an agricultural college near Stafford, where so it was kind of really back in the kind of the mid 90s when I'd probably say that I started really honing in on different species of birds, and kind of remembering that kind of towards the latter part of the 90s, when I went over to Wales to go and see red kites, and getting quite excited about seeing those. And I think when I went down into Cornwall back in, I think it was about 99, that I got to see buzzards for the first time, and I got quite excited about seeing buzzards sat on a fence post. And but yeah, and then like nowadays, that where I live currently now, that it's not uncommon to be seeing buzzards or red kites every single day. So yeah, so you notice things and bits like that. So it's probably kind of key milestones that you would say that you remember. And I remember, I think when I was about 11, going rock climbing in the Peak District, and seeing what I would say was an unusual blackbird. And then it wasn't until later on that I was on a training course, and they said, did we want to go over to the Peak District, to this rocky outcrop where there was ringoozles? And I'd say, yeah, well, let's go over there and see some ringoozles. And I'd say, that's what those birds were when I was about 10 years old. I just thought they were a strange blackbird.
As soon as you said a strange blackbird, I thought, oh my goodness, that's a ringoozle.
So yeah.
And I only saw my first one for the first time last year. So I'm in awe of you. Of all these birds that you've seen, I haven't yet managed to. We've had a few comments already, and someone has mentioned that they were super uncool then, and some might think it now, and I think probably the same for me too, but there you go. Now, when was it that you first saw heard your first nightingale?
I heard my first nightingale back in 2002, when I became the assistant warden at Grafham Water, which was a site kind of owned by Anglian Water, but it's managed by the Beds, Cambs and Northants Wildlife Trust. So I first got to hear my first nightingale in the April of 2002, but kind of started work with them on habitat management back in the September of 2001.
Oh, right. So when you first started that habitat management, and perhaps actually what we should do is describe what a nightingale is for people who may never have seen one and may not really know much about them. All I knew about them was, well, first of all, I knew that there was a song about a nightingale singing in, is it Berkeley Square?
Yeah.
And that they used to be very common, but now much, much less so. And that sometimes, because they are thought to be very strong singers and have very complex phrases in their song, I have fooled myself a few times thinking I've heard a nightingale when in fact it's been a song thrush. And I think several of us would have made those mistakes, because a nightingale seems nowadays such an exotic bird to hear. But would you just describe a little bit about what they look like?
So basically, a nightingale is about the same size of a robin, so a European robin. And if you imagine looking at a robin but without a red breast, so it is generally brown all over. There's slight different shades of brown over it, but generally it's brown. And then it's kind of got a rufusy, orangey, brick red tail to it. So you're more likely to hear them than actually see them. And they've got the ability to almost throw their song a little bit. So you could be stood right next to one and not actually really see it. So, but yeah, their song is kind of more what they're kind of recognised for. And also that nightingales go right the way back in kind of history with folklore and stories. And there's a lot of people that have written about them, like Keats and things like that. So yeah, so like you say, that about the Berkeley Square, the nightingale that's sung in Berkeley Square, that's quite nice, but it's probably a robin that was actually singing back then, rather than a nightingale. But it's always quite a nice kind of story to talk about.
They have got a very romanticised view about them, haven't they? This idea that this bird is singing out for its passion, where we sort of understand now that birds aren't singing for joy or for passion, but they're singing for to mark out territories or to call in mates. And you did actually share some song with me. I wonder if now would be a good time for me to just share that song so that people have got that in their mind before we go into your slides where you explain a lot more about the birds. So for people watching, I'm going to attempt to share my screen. This is going to be exciting because I've not done this before. I'll pretend that it's all very cool and I'm doing this wonderfully. So I'm going to see if I can do this. Trying to share the right bit. Okay, we'll go into that a little bit later. I can't find the right button to share. Okay, I'm sure we'll find that in a little while. So if we can go into your slides that you've got, we can, if you share your screen instead,
Yep.
I'm sure that'll be far more successful than mine.
Okay. Can you see it okay?
Yep, I can see that. And if anyone can let me know in the chat if you can see the screen okay.
So the project that I did back in 2012 was kind of a collaboration between Anglian Water, the BTO, which is the British Trust for Ornithology, and where I was concentrating a lot of my work was at Grafham Water. So that's kind of managed by the Bedfordshire, Cambridgeshire, Northamptonshire Wildlife Trust. So the nightingale is kind of a very charismatic bird in terms of its song, but it's associated with kind of scrubby trees. So that's like blackthorn and hawthorn, and like brambles and bits like that. So that's what they kind of like. They were traditionally a woodland kind of bird that used to follow coppice rotations around. So basically coppicing is where you cut a tree down to the base of the ground and you allow the tree regrowth to come up from it. And it would be kind of almost about 15 years, 20 years before those birds would be back into those kind of areas and they'd be suitable for them. But as kind of woodland management has kind of dropped off a little bit because of woodland production here in the UK, that's one of the kind of the issues with part of the decline. So the project back in 2012 was to kind of look at why nightingales are declining in the country and is there actually anything that we can be doing to prevent that decline. So kind of over the past 40 years, it doesn't sound long, but the actual population of nightingales have declined by about 90%. And as this map shows from one of the BTO guides, that it shows you where you've got kind of gains and losses and where the birds are actually still holding kind of territories. So there's a lot of kind of thought about why the birds are declining. Is it down to climate change, that's having a kind of a big impact, but you've also got the areas of land that's now being developed on. So whether that's for housing or roads or for agriculture. And also you've got the kind of the lack of management as well. So because the birds they nest in kind of scrubby habitats, so it's anything from the ground to about 1 meter high, that if it gets too open at the bottom, then it means that they're open for predation. And also that you've got one of the other things over here in the country, in the UK, which is a problem with muntjac deer, which are a non-native invasive species. So they'll be browsing off all the low vegetation and exposing those nests. But also you've got issues with rabbit grazing as well. So initially the project was looking at 3 sites, and then in 2015 we bought on Alton Water, where we've got another reservoir which is owned by Anglian Water, and we've got about 30 pairs of singing males on that site. So we bought that project in as well. So my kind of focus area is Grafham Water, and the red lines that you see on the map are kind of the routes that we took for where the birds were actually singing. So from 2012 to 2018, that I've worked out that we've walked 516 miles. We've spent 393 hours listening for nightingales. I've carried out 131 surveys, and I've had 72 volunteers, whether that's from angling water with people within the business or kind of friends and family that have helped out as well. And then I've spent 408 hours out on the nature reserve ringing and catching nightingales. So when we're going out and doing the surveys, this is kind of one of the best areas for the nightingales on site. And with all surveys that you're wanting, this is kind of for scientific data. So the best thing to do is to follow the same route as what you're going to do for the next time after that, so that the results are compared, that can be compared, and that they're comparable with each other, so that you are always trying to keep the same thing. And the surveys were carried out 4 times a week, so we were doing kind of like 2 early mornings, so just before dawn, and then 2 midnight surveys as well. And within the mix of all that, I was still going out bird ringing as well. So this is what you're wanting to do. And that despite the weather that we were out there, whatever the weather was throwing at us. So I think on my second visit that it was absolutely throwing it down, and you thought, crikey, I've got to get out of the car into all this rain. But we did find that when it was really foggy on site, that the birds never really sang that much, because the song doesn't resonate that much in the fog. So that was kind of slightly disappointing when you were out at midnight and it was thick with fog and you weren't hearing any birds, but you'd still got kind of a 3-hour walk around the whole of the site. So what we also did was that I mapped or marked down the arrival times of when we were getting nightingales out onto site. And as you'll notice in the top graph, that so the birds were starting to come onto site earlier and earlier, and then by 2018 they went back up to the 25th of April. And if people can kind of cast their minds back, but in 2018 was when we had the beast from the east. So I know that we had that in the March, but if you imagine that a nightingale is coming all the way up from Africa, that by the time it was hitting France, kind of in the latter part of March, that they also had snow and things like that. So that was one of the reasons why the birds kind of arrived in the UK late. And that was kind of the same for a lot of the other migrant species as well. And then in the bit down below, the chart below, I've highlighted when in blue where the nightingales were singing. And then you'll notice where at the end of the columns that you've got like B1 and G1, and these are all down to habitat codes. So each time you heard a nightingale, you wrote down the kind of the habitat requirements or that was around that call. So I'm not saying that back in 2015, I think when this one was done, that we had 17 males on site. It was just that there was 17 different locations. And then so when you're doing your survey, that you're writing down or you're marking down a little circle to say where you're hearing a nightingale. And then if you've got interactions with other male nightingales, that you put down a dotted line. And hopefully you'll be able to see that where we've got number 13 and number 1, that this was actually the same bird. It just so happened it moved from one place to the next, and you just draw a continuous straight line, which just shows that it's actually the same bird. Because if you can imagine that you're probably going to do we did about 26 surveys, and this is what your map would look like afterwards. So what you're doing now is that you compile all 26 surveys onto one sheet, and you try to work out where the nightingale territories are on site. And this is how you can work out what population you have got. So kind of put it into kind of another type of map, so you can see that this is what it looked like in 2012. And then the population starts to get a lot bigger in 13. And then in 2014 that it got even bigger. And again in 2015. And then the population started to go down. And then in 2018, this is when we just only had one bird, but this was probably down to kind of late arrivals and bits like that. But we only heard one bird in 2018. And then slowly we're getting a few more numbers back up. 2020 last year, which is the kind of the COVID year, so that was quite a hard one because we're all in lockdown, and this was when we came straight out of lockdown that I went out to Grafham Water to go and have a listen to see if I could hear any nightingales, and I could pick up 3. And then this year I've heard 5 in this location, and then there's another one further down on site. So the numbers are moving back up hopefully in the right direction. And then when you kind of overlay all those kind of data marks, that you start to see kind of where your scrubby habitats are, and this will then start to hopefully form your kind of management plan that we've got on site. So we can now work out where to target the specific types of management for nightingales. So like I said, that a nightingale likes the thick, dense, scrubby habitat. But with this bit, it's getting quite old, and you can see at the bottom there's lots of gaps. So one of the things that I did back in 2001 was that I suggested to my manager at the time that when we're doing the management for nightingales, that rather than doing the coppicing work where you're kind of resetting things back to for almost 15 years, that could we not try something like hedge laying? So this is what this is. It's kind of scrub layering. So you're basically cutting through the back of the tree and bending it over, and it's the tree's still alive because you've got the front section that is still attached to the main part of the stump, and that will allow the sap and that to rise up through the tree. And as you can see in this photograph here, you've got the new little bits of regrowth that will then be kind of filling in these extra gaps. So this was kind of a mixture of scrub layering and coppice work, and then you were leaving some of the tall bits so that the nightingales could actually be singing from. So, and we found that with this type of management, I'm not saying that it's the type of management to do, but we found here at Grafham that within about 4 years we were having the nightingales returning to these patches, and this is what it kind of looks like after about 4 or 5 years. And because we'd worked with the British Trust for Ornithology, we then revised the Managing Scrub for Nightingales, a little handbook that can be downloaded from their website, and we've got a case study in there with Grafham and the work that I've done over there in terms of the management work. So that was quite exciting, really, to kind of have the work that I've been doing since 2001 actually being documented and put down into something that's potentially usable for people. So with the project, so when we were doing so when you go out catching nightingales, it's all done under kind of license. So I've got a special license that allows me to play a recording of a male nightingale singing, and it allows me to entice him out of the scrub around, and it makes him think that there's another male singing in his territory. And because nightingales, it's only the males that sing, the female doesn't. She does like a little croaking noise, but the male is the one that has the song. So you play a recording for him, and hopefully he responds to that and flies into the net. And then you carefully take the bird out of the net, And then now we've got the bird in our hands, and this is when we start to ring the bird. And the bird is probably in your hands for a few minutes, and while you're taking down various measurements, so you kind of make sure that it is a male that's come into the net. So you check to see if it's a male or a female, and then we take some measurements. So we take a measurement of their wings and their tail feathers, because the other bit with them being a migratory species, that there's now actually thoughts that birds are starting to develop longer wing feathers to get those bigger migration journeys. So if you think of some of the blackbirds that we see over in the winter in this country, that we get an influx of birds that come over from Scandinavia, and when you catch the Scandinavian blackbirds, they don't really look an awful lot different to our UK ones, but their wings are actually slightly longer. So by taking these extra measurements, we're starting to build a bigger picture of how birds are actually starting to evolve and developing longer wing feathers. So part of the project was to, like I said, to try and work out why the species of bird is in massive decline. And the photograph on the left-hand side is a geolocator. So this measures light intensity levels. And then the one on the right-hand side is a GPS. So the GPS gives you kind of better, more accurate data. So the GPS gets you, I think, within about 5 meter radius of the tag, whereas the light sensor one, that is a little bit bigger of an area, but they both kind of do similar kind of things, but one measures light intensity and the other one is a GPS positioning. But so you put these on the bird and then you release them, and then you then have to catch them the following year to retrieve the data. So it's not like the tags that you see with cuckoos or ospreys, or even like the white-tailed eagles, that those transmitters are a lot bigger and they're able to catch, to connect up to satellite, and that information can be downloaded straight to a laptop or a computer. But whereas these ones, you actually need that bird to make that journey back to the UK before you can take that data off it or the tag off it. And the tag acts like almost like a little rucksack. So you put it over the legs, and it goes out and sits over the back of the bird. And then what we then did was that we marked down the locations of where we'd released the birds with trackers, so that the following year we could come back into those same locations to catch those birds again. So in 2012 we had permission to put out 20 trackers on the back of the birds, and in 2013 we caught 13 of those 20 birds, which is quite amazing really, because we only really expected about 5 to actually make that journey back, but to actually have 13 was quite amazing really. And then, so this is what you kind of get. So this is down in Africa, in East Africa. You can see that the majority of the birds are kind of around Senegal, the Gambia and Guinea area. And the ones that you can see highlighted in red, well, these ones did something quite unusual with their migration. So normally when you think of birds that migrate for the winter, that as soon as they hit their wintering grounds, that's it, they stay there all winter until the spring the following year before they move then back north, back to their breeding grounds. But these 4 decided that they would actually have a second winter elsewhere, which was quite unusual. So you can see, I'll point out with the red one. So this arrived in the Senegal and the Gambia region. Don't worry about that, it was out at sea. It's just because of the tracking part of it works on longitude and latitude with the light intensity. But you can see that it arrived in Africa on the 12th of September, and then on the 8th of February it left and then came down to came down to Sierra Leone on the 13th of February, where it was then there until the 22nd of March, before it then left and came back up to the UK. So whilst we've been doing kind of our surveys and our studies over in England, in the UK, that kind of our counterparts have been doing their research as well. And you can start to see, this is quite interesting, that actually our UK ones that come up through Africa and into Europe and back to the southeast and the central part of England, that our population doesn't actually mingle or meet up with any of the other kind of European birds. You can see the Bulgarian ones that they go into almost Central Africa and don't actually meet up with any of the other populations. So this is one of the other thoughts, that why probably the UK population might not be doing very well, because it doesn't actually meet up with any of the other populations. So it's kind of its own, you could almost say, sub-race of a nightingale, of the European nightingale. So it's quite interesting. And this is the kind of tracking data that we have got from the bird, and you can see the yellow line shows its kind of autumn/winter migration, and then the green line is when it then comes back from Sierra Leone back up to Grafham Water. And if you can see on there that, say, like when it's leaving Sierra Leone, so it left Sierra Leone on the 22nd of March, and then it hit southern Spain by the 25th. So within 3 days, it took 3 days to actually fly over the best part of Africa, and then where it rested up and fed for a couple of weeks before it then moved up into kind of northern France, and then before it came back into Grafham Water. So it arrived at Grafham Water on the 19th, and I happened to be out on site on the 20th when I heard it in the location that we managed to get the tag off it. So that is, it's quite amazing really to think that this bird has flown. This is about just over 4,000 miles, if you think of a straight line, that this bird has flown. So and to think that it's the size of a robin, it weighs about 21 grams. So quite amazing really to think that bird has flown all the way from Sierra Leone to back to Grafham Water. And with ringing all the nightingales, I've marked down all their kind of locations, because this made it kind of easy when we were going to be going back onto site to catch the nightingales. So what you'll notice with 3 of them, I've written tag by the side of it, which kind of indicates they were the tagged birds, which then also meant that I'd had to catch another couple of other birds to show that we weren't going to be having a problem with those tags on the back of the birds. So you've got to think that if you had only your non-tagged birds making it back and no tags coming back, you could actually then start to say that those tags were starting to have an impact on those birds' behaviour, whether it be flying or anything like that. But I found that we had just as many. We had 4 out of the 5 birds back. So we had 2 tagged back and the 2 untagged birds back. So this is 2012. And this is in 2013. And we always like to think, especially with nightingales, that the bird that we heard that one year, or like this year, that we heard a bird singing in that one bush, and it was the same from the previous year and the same from the previous year back. We always like to think that it holds that exact same territory. But whereas with ringing, we're now starting to show that this actually isn't the case. So you can see that the birds were starting to move around on site. So if you imagine that these 3 areas here were kind of where our tags were, well, I had a brand new bird in this location where there was a tag. So this bird had moved further north, which then had displaced that one over, and the one that was here then moved further up. And then the only one that stayed the same was this bird here. And then in 2014, I only had one of the original birds back, and then I had all these new ones on site, which then started getting me to think that we've got another site nearby, a place called Paxton Pits, which is only about 3 miles away. And I started to think that actually, are these birds actually more of a landscape type bird rather than actually being site specific? So I started to speak to the warden who manages the site over there to see if I could get permission to go and catch the nightingales over there, to see if there was any kind of correlation between that site and this site here at Grapham. But it was a little bit inconclusive with it. But then still, in 2015, you can see that the birds are still moving around on the site. So it started, you felt like that there was more questions coming forward rather than answers being gained from some of this work. But it's always good to get more questions because it gives you more time to try and find those answers. And I must say that even though the ring, with me ringing these, because we were putting tags on the birds, and I wasn't licensed at that point to be putting tags on the back of the birds, I was having to wait for people to come out onto these sites. So it makes it skews the data a little bit, because I've only been able to catch those like nightingales once that season. So I couldn't really catch a nightingale and then re-catch it again kind of a week or so later or a few days later, because it just knew that the song that I was playing actually wasn't a proper nightingale. So it made it quite hard. So, but we were still finding that the birds were moving around on site. So this is 2017, and then this is the year that we had the beast from the east. And this one here that I managed to catch it took me longer to actually put the net up than it did to actually catch the nightingale. So yeah, by the time I put the call on and I started to walk away, that it was in the bottom of the net. So so went and collected it out of that. And 2019, and that's it. So I will hand back to you.
Thank you very much for that. That is amazing. I realised afterwards that we should probably have said at the beginning that they do migrate, that they live the majority of their time in Africa and then just come up to Europe and to the UK for breeding. Do we know why they choose to do that? Why they would even make it up to the UK? Because I would imagine that there's plenty of sites in France. So when they're doing their stop off there, I would have thought that they would just stop there. So what makes them come all the way into the UK?
Well, when they start coming up into the UK, that we're kind of in their most northerly part of their territory range. So as we know about kind of with climate change in that, where as the climate is starting to get warmer, we've started to see kind of species of whether it's birds or butterflies actually starting to move further north. Well, with nightingales, that it's the kind of the exact opposite. It's actually decreasing, and they're being pulled kind of almost to the southeast. But yeah, so they are, when you start getting up towards Grapham and Rutland Water, that they are kind of almost at their most northerly kind of range of them. But yeah, like you say, Susie, they arrive in the beginning of April, and then by the end of July, they're then starting to make their way back out of the UK, back down to Africa. So they're only here for a couple of months. And probably one of the other reasons why they make that massive journey is because of the amount of daylight hours that we have. So if you think at the moment that it's starting to get light at 4 o'clock in the morning, and I mean, like now it's 20 to 9, and it's still light out there. So we've still probably got about another 15 more minutes of daylight hours. So that's a long time for those birds to be feeding up, and that's one of the other reasons, and that they're up here. And because if you think down in Africa, that you're so close to the equator that you'll only be having like 12 hours of daylight. So the sun rises really quick and then it goes really fast. There's not really a proper sunset down on the equator. So only having 12 hours of daylight down there compared to, can't think off the top of my head how many hours that you'd have up here, probably, what's it, about 18 hours, something like that, of daylight hours. So yeah, and also that in terms of their breeding, that I don't know if you were going to ask if there's a question that's coming through about that, but the call, we talked about the call earlier, that when the male sings kind of at night, so that's usually the best time to be hearing them, because you don't get to hear all the other birds like the dawn chorus. As nice as that is, but when you're trying to survey for nightingales, it's easy to go kind of in the middle of the night at midnight, because that is really the only bird that's singing. But at those kind of times that the male call, not that we really hear any difference in it, but that's more about attracting a female that's flying at night. So it's attracting her to him, to his territory. And then as soon as the daylight starts to appear, his call slightly changes. It becomes more aggressive. And that is to kind of ward off rival males out of his patch. So generally, once the female and he's paired up with a female, his call changes and he goes into more of like a croaking and piping type noise. He'll do a little bit of singing, but not very much, and that's because he's got a female and she's probably on eggs somewhere. And yeah, I think they incubate she incubates the eggs for about 14 days, and then about 12 days later, once they've hatched, within 12 days those chicks are ready to be leaving the nest, and they'll be feeding up before they start making their way back off to Africa. So a really quick turnaround when you think about it.
Yeah, really amazing. We have had one question from Denise Foss. Do you ring females too?
I do. It's very hard to catch the females, because they don't really respond that much to the lures. It's more of the males that respond to them. But I have had a few females, and that's because when I've recorded a male singing, that I've gone out in the middle of the night and recorded a singing male. And I think that's one of the other reasons why I've been catching females, because when I play that call, it attracts the females out. Whereas if I've taken a call kind of mid-morning, I don't really get them. I get generally more males responding to those, but in the kind of the midnight ones, I do occasionally get females being caught as well. But yes, I do ring those, but we don't put the tags. We didn't put the tags on the back of those birds because there's kind of a thought that they might not be site faithful. It's generally the males that are site faithful. So if you're wanting the tag back, and bear in mind that these tags, the geolocators, I think they were about £300. And then the GPS ones, they were getting towards the £400 mark. So it's a lot of money to put on the back of a bird to potentially not get back. So the females are ringed as normal and kind of let go. So when I've usually caught those nightingales, I take them back to those territories that they came out of, rather than releasing them somewhere in the middle of a field that's close. But I prefer to actually go and take them back and put them straight back on their territory as quick as I can.
There's another question just from Denise again. You mentioned fog, but do they sing in the rain?
They do. They still sing in the rain. So the rain doesn't really stop them. It's only us that when we're getting out of the car that you think, I don't really want to be getting soaked. That's the only thing. But yeah, they will sing through the rain as well. But it's just the fog that they don't sing through.
I was just going to say that maybe I'll attempt to share that file again so that people can actually hear what the
Yep.
nightingale sings like. So please bear with me, everyone, while I show you all sorts of strange things on my computer while I'm trying to find this file. I can share a video file. Oh, maybe that's what I want to do. If only I... Oh, excellent. Looks like we can do this. Just bear with me. Oh, started playing it again. Just bear with when I... Oh, sorry, Mike.
I was going to say, what you'll notice that where you've got the gaps in the sonograph where it goes quiet, that they're always the same. They're always the same space in between it. So whatever nightingale I've recorded, it's almost like you can go 1, 2, 3, 4, and it joins into the next one every time.
Oh.
So there's meant to be. I mean, the call is really complex for the size of the bird. It's got they reckon about 1,000 different phrases of its song that it puts together, and compare that to a blackbird that has 100 different phrases. And the other bit with it, I think, is quite amazing with the nightingale, is that if you are lucky enough to see one singing, there's times that you just see where its beak is just moving, and that's because part of their song actually goes past our hearing range.
Wow.
And they reckon that there's about 25% of that song that we actually don't hear. So yeah, quite amazing, really. I think.
Stunning, yeah. I'm just going to come back off that screen, possibly, or we might be looking at it for the rest of the night. Hold on a sec. Oh, here we go. There we go. Yeah, that is amazing. And I just chose sort of 6. Someone has come in with a question. I thought they were going to say, "Can you play it again?" No, because I can't bring it up again. Let's just see what the. So it's someone from the Facebook group. Can you explain how they do this? The exact space between calls and the complexity of the sounds.
I think it's just how the birds will naturally sing. It's like how we talk, that still you'll be breathing and things like that. So it'll be kind of they build things in phrases in short bursts, because if you got to think that they've got to be singing quite loud to be getting over kind of background noise and bits like that. So they'll kind of, it's just like what I was saying, that it's like with us talking, we pause for a breath before we launch into the next bit. But with a bird, that they're always, it's just the same, like with nightingales, it's just the same set pattern of spacing. And
on one of those phrases that I meant to point out while it was on the screen, there was sort of an echoing of another, or a pre-echo of another, but it was another bird in the background.
It's another bird. It's another nightingale in the background. And sometimes if they're singing long enough, they will then start to mimic each other and kind of copy each other as well. So the idea is to kind of outdo each other. And the recording that I think I sent to you, that was done, I think, at about midnight. So it is kind of it was a quiet evening. There was no wind and things like that. So the birds were just kind of singing off at each other. So it was quite nice, really.
We've got another comment, possibly from the same person. Unfortunately, with the Facebook group, unless you give it permission, StreamYard permission, it won't show your name. So I don't know if it's the same person. But this person said, yes, the regularity of their calls or song. I always like to count the space in between utterances, like sparrows, etc. It's fun to do until something distracts them.
It is, and like I just said, pointed out with the Nightingale, that if you're counting four, that it is every four, and just when you've done the fourth, it then starts again. And I told that my 7-year-old daughter, and she thought that was amazing. That we were listening to a recording of one, and we were all sat around the kitchen table going 1, 2, 3, 4, and then it would start, and then you'd listen to it sing, and then you'd be 1, 2, 3, 4, and it'd go again.
I wish I'd known that before I went to Suffolk, because I was hearing this bird singing in the night, and it was such a different sound to anything that I'd heard before, which is what immediately made me think of the Nightingale. And it did do it in, there were pauses between the phrases, but I think sometimes it felt like it was falling asleep. It's like, I'll have a sing and then I'll just sleep for a little bit and then I'll go back to sing again.
Yeah.
It was clearly that same thing. And that last phrasing that was on the sonograph that I showed just now, or the sonogram, the one where it was kind of like a very high pitched repeated before it then went into a sort of regular call. I was hearing that definitely, and I mentioned I did an imitation of that in my podcast this week, which I'm not going to repeat now. But if you want to hear me imitate a nightingale badly, you can hear it in the podcast. But I'm convinced that's what I heard. So next year I'll be looking for them as well, because it's amazing to think. I mean, to be honest, there are so many birds in this country that I've not seen yet, and probably not heard either. But, to think that they come all the way from Africa, they make those really, really long journeys and are just here for such a short time. It's just a real wonder of nature that this happens. And, the possibility of getting a chance to hear them or see them is just, I don't know, to witness that and to know the story behind. So to hear about the work you've done with the tags and knowing that the birds are, are not joining up with other populations and are doing their own routes into the UK.
Yeah, if you, I mean, with the bird ringing side of it, I feel it's such a privilege to be able to handle those birds and to be collecting the data and know that data is actually being used. And then the bird that I showed you that had gone all the way down to Sierra Leone. So we'd caught that bird as an adult, and that was in 2012, and it was still, I last caught it in 2015. And if you kind of work out the miles that it's done, so if it was an adult in 2012, so it would have been a juvenile bird in 2011, so it's probably hatched in 2010. So it could have potentially been like a 5-year-old bird, and that's almost done, probably getting on towards 80,000 miles that bird had done. So it's those kind of bits that I think it kind of makes you sometimes feel insignificant with things, and that we think that we're quite important when actually there's a lot of things out there that are doing things just to survive. So I feel that the work that I've been doing with whether it's with Angling Water, with the Wildlife Trust and my volunteers, that we're actually trying to make a difference. And then I think it was back in 2018 when we'd finished a lot of the research work that we held a conference to bring a lot of the Wildlife Trusts together. We brought people like RSPB, BirdLife International in, because even though I work to a region, that these birds don't see regions, they don't see geographical places, they don't see that they're flying into France or the UK. They don't see any of that, so they see no borders. So even though we work in borders, that I wanted to get kind of international people over, so that to use this data that we'd been gathering to actually try and get change in in France and down into Spain and different parts of Africa. Because if it's the same, when you look at the route that the nightingales are taking, it's a similar kind of route that cuckoos are taking. It's the same route that ospreys are taking. So there's obviously something with those routes. And the idea is that why should we sit on this data ourselves and not actually share it and it be used not only here in the UK, but kind of elsewhere?
So we would be able to use that data to consider what is it about the habitats it's either overflying and stopping in, or where it's ending up, to make sure that we're not denuding those areas of the one kind of habitat that it needs. And you
Yeah,
mentioning earlier about the difficulties with the muntjac deer or rabbits, and potentially with people changing the size of fields and getting rid of hedgerows, all of that would mean that they make that journey and then don't find the habitat that they need to be able to make their nests. And
yeah,
and that's things that could happen without even realizing, but your work is showing what's needed, so we know to protect those areas, or to reform those areas to make sure that they're
yeah.
available.
And we kind of touched on about like climate change, because kind of our climate kind of mirrors, like in terms of the rainy season in Africa, that our spring starts at roughly the same kind as those rainy seasons in Africa. So as the rain starts moving further north for Africa, it means that those flies and that start coming out of those ponds and those bumper crops that those birds will be needing, like nightingales or swifts or swallows, that kind of marries kind of what happens in the UK with in terms of our spring starting. So if they start to get out of kilter with each other, then you could actually find that the birds that rely on those migratory seasons, like the rainy seasons, if they haven't started their migration at that point, that you could find that those ponds have already started having the insects hatching and flying out, that by the time they get to those pools, they could have actually come to the end of when the main crop of flies is, which means that they've not fed up that much and got the fat reserves on before they need to make that next crossing, and then being pushed to go further north to find somewhere else to try and fuel up before they make the next stop. And sometimes that's what can sometimes happen with kind of the lack of food, and like you say, the kind of habitat loss as well that with it all. So yeah, so it's a very fine balance with it all. But then you've got kind of really good kind of environmental schemes over here in the UK where the government are trying to encourage farmers and other landowners to put hedgerows back and put bigger field margins in and put ditches back and put wood and ponds in. So we've got a site not far away from Grafham where back in March I created 4 woodland ponds that we've got a big population just on the outskirts of our site, but I'm looking at trying to improve that site for nightingales, and we've dug kind of 4 woodland ponds in there as well. It won't be good for me surveying them, being bitten by mosquitoes and things like that, but as long as the nightingales and other birds like it, then that's fine by me.
That's brilliant. We've got a couple of other comments here. It was Merrily from North Vancouver who had mentioned before, and she said it's deeply moving about the strength and related vulnerability of migrating birds. And it really is, because I've only recently started reading about migration and understanding what goes on. I knew birds moved around, but didn't really know what happened during migration. And it is really awe-inspiring and thought-provoking. And Leslie from Ottawa says, thank you, Mike, for this very important work that you do on behalf of the Nightingales for all of us. And thank you for this truly informative and enjoyable presentation. And I'd like to echo Leslie's comments there, because I heard you speak earlier this year, and it really enlightened me about what goes on in the skies over our heads and seasonally that many of us don't even know about. You mentioned just now about making sure the hedgerows are back, and getting farmers to manage the hedgerows and make them more rich environments. And I think, for the general public, they just think, yeah, okay, it's nice. A few robins or blackbirds get an extra place to nest, but I don't think it's really spoken about how important those things are for a range of species and how important it is in the ecosystem. So I really thank you for sort of pointing those things out and for sharing that with us.
Because like with the management of the scrubby stuff, that if you imagine that when it's kind of really tall, about 20 feet high, something like that, that it can actually shade out a lot of things underneath. But then as soon as you bring that tree canopy down, whether it's via like coppicing or the layering work, you then get a burst of flowers, whether it's like primroses, bluebells if you're in ancient woodlands. You get lots of other type of wildflowers that are coming back up through, that are kind of the ones that have been missing the sunlight, which then means that they're a good nectar source for bees and butterflies and moths, and which then are great food sources for birds and everything else. So actually by kind of managing woodlands and bits like that, it actually improves a lot of other diversity as well. So sometimes it can look quite drastic what you've done, but on the other side, that if you leave it a year or two, that it looks like you've never really been in there and everything's green again. And so it's quite amazing really about what you can do and how kind of sometimes fragile everything is.
I'll just see is there any more questions that anyone wants to ask, because we're drawing to the end of our evening with Mike. But I want to thank you once again, Mike, for sharing all of your knowledge with us and for the work that you're doing, and for sharing the Nightingale song with us as well. Which, when I put this out in the episode, you've given me permission to share that song as well, so people will be able to hear it.
I was going to say that if I can, I could put the piping noise that the nightingale makes when, if it will work, if I hold my phone up to my microphone, you can hear so you'll hear a piping and a croaking noise, and this is a contact call that the male does. The female does the croaking noise. So once, like I said, that once he's finished kind of marking out his territory, he goes into this piping and croaking noise, which is more of a contact bit to make sure that the female knows that he's still there. So.
Wow. It actually sounds quite insect-like, that croaking. But if you're happy to share that with me, I'll make sure that goes into the episode as well, so that you can hear that.
I was going to show you, if you can see it, that this is the little tag that was on the back of the Nightingale that went all the way down to Sierra Leone and back.
Wow.
So you can see how kind of big it is. So if I just put my thumb next to it, you can see how the sizes of it.
So I was just looking at my own thumb to just try to gauge how big that is.
So it weighs just shy of a gram. So just less than a gram in weight.
That is awesome. So it's not really affecting the bird. Well, you got the birds back again, so you know that they can make that journey.
Yeah.
And Denise has just said, thanks very much. Very informative and reassuring to know that progress is being made in catering for the needs of those birds. But thank you so much for your time this evening, Mike.
No worries.
Thank you to everyone who's watched, and hopefully we'll be having more of these sessions over the next few months. I'm just coming up to my 100th episode, which is amazing for me.
Fantastic.
And for those of you in the Facebook group, I'm going to have a live chat on Sunday evening. But thanks very much again to Mike for spending time with us. And if you're in the Facebook group, you'll know that Mike is a very active member in there. So come along and chat with him. Is there anywhere that do you have a presence online, Mike, where people can interact with you other than in the Facebook group?
I do have a Twitter account, which is Michaelmas79. So I tweet on there about some of the things that I do for work, or we have got an angling water account which is called Coast and Country. So find out about what angling water is doing in terms of biodiversity work and our catchment work, where we're working with farmers in terms of kind of chemicals and what goes into rivers, and we're trying not to get those into rivers where we abstract water from. So find out all things like that, what we're doing for the environment with angling water.
That's brilliant. I don't think I'm following you, so I better make sure that I do.
Please do.
Okay, well, thanks very much. And thanks everyone for watching this evening, and see you all again soon.
Cheers. Bye.